My name's Bharat, I'm from Trend Micro, and over the next kind of 30 minutes, what we're going to be looking into is really some strategies and some capabilities around looking at risks and mitigating them in the cloud. The first question to be asking is why is it important, right? And really, it's nothing new when you think about it. All organizations are using cloud more and more now, heavily dependent on it. We're also seeing that it's become the new playground for threat actors, certainly to have a go, to hijack, to sabotage, to do other bits and pieces, right? And really, we need to think about securing that. From a user's point of view, it's all about protecting sensitive data, it's having those kind of keeping your reputation high, and it's protecting your customers, right? These are the things that really matter. And when we think about these things, it's not a straightforward issue. You know, last year we did a study, and you can see the number of customers that were impacted due to a cloud breach. And there are various different schemes going on. Crypto mining being one of them, ransomware being another one. And we're seeing more and more of these crimes innovating. So suppose that leads to the question, why is it complex? And it's down to a number of different things. But inherently, if you think about the cloud, it's dynamic in its nature. And that introduces complexity straight away. And then when you start to layer on top of that, you know, most organizations will be in a hybrid world. Unless you're kind of greenfield in the cloud native from day one, you're going to have some kind of on-premise element. Secondly is the kind of evolving threat landscape. As we kind of innovate, defend and protect, we're seeing threat actors also do the same thing. They're innovating in a way that is absolutely phenomenal. In fact, most organizations would be envious as to how this ecosystem operates. The other bit I want to kind of bring to the fore is the shared responsibility model. We've spoken about shared responsibility for a number of years, but still it causes confusion and some chaos, knowing where does the boundary lie between the cloud provider and what you're responsible for. And I suppose the bigger question that goes around that is, when you look at some of those cloud native services, are you prepared to accept the risk? Are you prepared to kind of look at those cloud native services? They give a level of protection, but how does it fit in with your own risk appetite? And so you can see that there are multiple things to think about. And I suppose, if you think about it, the first thing we need to all kind of recognize is that cloud inherently introduces risk. And it introduces risk at all levels. And what I mean by all levels, all stages, is this is a typical cloud journey that we see organizations go through. They might be on the kind of far left-hand side. They're just dipping their toes into the cloud. They've got on-premise workloads, data, and they're going to take some of the low sensitivity stuff and migrate out, take a risk-free approach. As you start to build some confidence, you then start looking at capabilities around microservices, start looking at containers, start looking at some cloud-native services as well. So start looking at cloud file storage, using serverless and Lambda functions to kind of do more machine to machine. Is actually having freedom of choice, saying, actually, I have one cloud provider, I want to be able to switch to another cloud provider at will, a full utility model. And so really, you know, the more you consume of these services, the more complex it becomes, the more risks you start to introduce into the platform. And the number one kind of factor that I have seen, and it still continues today, is that security teams have to keep up with the innovation. Right? Developers are under pressure daily from business unit owners to kind of push new applications through. We see developers continually making changes, wanting to deploy. And what we see, the blocker in that line is typically the security team. And really to kind of make security an enabler, we have to keep up pace. And just to give you an indication of some of the challenges around this, this is just a quick snapshot of what I would say, what we saw at the back end of 2023. These were just some of the services that were announced by AWS. But this is nothing new. These services and the numbers of services, it's a continual process. We're seeing big launches throughout the year with new services coming on board. What that obviously means is for developers, they want to leverage those services to drive the innovation. They want to do things in a different way. They want to kind of get more agility. They want speed. They want to actually drive business and get more revenue. But from a security standpoint, it's a headache, right? New services being used without understanding what the implications are. And what I mean by the implications, the implications could be regulatory, it could be compliance-based, it could be what weaknesses does it introduce? And the question is, how do you keep up? And really that's the kind of the name of the game here is how does security kind of keep up? So the one thing, that's got to be a fundamental pillar here is that security has to be real time. That is absolutely non-negotiable, right? Security has to understand in real time what the risks are, what the threats are, and how do we put a protection and a mitigation strategy around that. The problem is, in this dynamic world, things are changing. How do you get a handle on that? So you really need to think about a different approach. Taking the approach that you would have maybe have done on premise doesn't really fly in the cloud, especially when we see things spinning up and spinning down. So really what we need to think about on a continuous basis is we need to identify, right? We need to look at the inventory of what have we got out there. And what I mean on a continuous basis, I mean in real time, cycling around all the time. Because you don't know when something's popped up and spun back down again. You need to be able to look at the configuration of those services, of the infrastructure that's out there, and map and understand the risk rating against it. From a numeric value, it could be a risk score that you want to apply on that, right? So that gives you an idea of actually what does my exposure look like, and where should I start to focus some of my energies? And this kind of leads on to the first part of what I'd say is making the switch from reactive to proactive security. The second part is actually we've got our infrastructure laid out. Need to think about what are the applications that are running? What do they interact with? How do they work? And that connects very heavily to things like API configuration. More and more now, everything is API driven. If you think about internet facing assets, machine to machine communication, it's all about API driven comms that go on. And then the last but not least, it's that kind of compliance and regulatory regimes that you may have. Depending on the vertical that you're in, you may have some government-based regimes that you may have to follow, like GDPR. You may have some industry-related ones, like PCI. Ultimately, there are going to be some regimes you need to follow. The question is, how do you monitor in real time and take action in real time? So with that in mind, certainly at Trend Micro, we've been thinking about this problem for a while and understanding what does that modern security toolkit need to look like? And what I mean by toolkit, actually, I'm not talking about the tools itself. I'm talking about really strategies that you have in mind, underpinned by capabilities, right? Two very different things, strategy and capabilities. And really, the way we want to start looking at this is getting ahead of the curve. And what we mean by that is looking at your infrastructure and understanding the risk that it poses in real time. I've mentioned about this before. In the kind of old world security, it's your standard process of doing risk management. Understanding what assets you have, what exposure does it pose, mapping it to a criticality list. You might even do some risk quantification around that. If something happens, what's the net impact of that? And then you'd think about what is the kind of mitigation strategy around that. You might say, actually, this risk I cannot tolerate. I will put whatever I can in there to kind of stop it from happening. But the premise of that comes down to the threat model that you adapt. And threat model kind of gives you a feel for, what the net impact could go on to be. Now, sometimes you might say, okay, I will do something to downplay the risk. Or you might even say, I'm going to put my head in the sand and I'm going to ignore the risk, or I might transfer it. So this is where one of the misconceptions comes in with that shared responsibility model that I talked about. Sometimes organizations think I can just transfer the risk to the cloud provider. Actually, no. You might have some other mechanisms. You might use cyber insurance and things, but you certainly won't. Your cloud provider won't take that risk. Right? You're ultimately responsible. So what we're looking at here is getting that holistic view of your environment and understanding where do I need to focus and prioritize my energies. So that's the first thing. The second thing we need to look at is detection and response capabilities. Now, if you remember my kind of second slide, I talked about the complexities of that. One of the complexities around that really is the log collection, the different formats, how do you pull it all together, how do you make sense of it? But you need to have that as a core capability, and you need the ability to use automation around that. Have things on tap, ready to go, right? You need to kind of have an understanding of what assets you have, how it's being used, looking at the event streams, so events, alerts, alarms, and understanding whether this is good behavior, bad behavior, or something that requires further investigation. So you need to think about that incident response capability and about that kind of threat hunting aspect of it as well. And then the last piece around this, or the third pillar, is all around the protection piece. This has to be a given, right? What I mean by that is, let's say you've got a house. You've got no window locks or anything like that. You might say, actually, I'm going to deploy a CCTV camera, so you've got my detection response, but I'm not going to put any door locks on or anything like that. I don't see the point of doing that. You need to have the basic protection in to be able to get to the next layer, to be able to get to the next layer, right? And you need to have that capability across the services that you consume. So be it virtual machines, be it Lambda functions, be it cloud native services like S3 buckets, you need to have that capability through and through. And actually you need to extend that capability out towards, I would say, users in terms of their identity, and also how data is also being used. And we'll look at that in a second. So those three pillars kind of come together. And I suppose a better way of kind of explaining this in a more kind of conceptual way is, if we think about this big round circle as our attack surface, and what I mean by attack surface is, what is kind of seen by the internet or by third parties, or what does that look like? The very first part is, this is now kind of working in reverse sequence. We think about the protection first and foremost. And these are capabilities like anti-malware, firewalling, IPS. These are those protection mechanisms I spoke about before, the window locks, the door locks on your house, right? And they consume, I would say, a part of that attack surface. What you then layer on top of that is your detection and response capability. So we've seen the industry move towards EDR, endpoint detection response. This is a variation of that. We're going now towards cloud detection response, but you need that capability, right? Typical things that we see in this space are things like NDR, EDR, identity detection response. Very much on the back foot, on the reactive foot, and we'll see how that fits in. And then the last piece is around that, I would say, attack surface management, the risk side of things. This is where we're looking to kind of understand the exposure, quantify the risk, have a remedial plan and do something about it. Actually, one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about it in the last slide was people can do this and can do it in a manual way. The problem is it takes time to do. If you're good at doing it, you could do it on a monthly basis. You can get some tools to do it, maybe do it a bit quicker. But in this agile world of the cloud, you need to do it real time, all the time, every time, 365, and have that picture. And that's where the challenge comes in, doing it at hyperscale. So when we put it into kind of a play mode, what we see is that first two circles, they lead to what you do during an attack. When your organization is being attacked, these are tools you're typically going to use, your SOC teams, your analysts, and people like that. What ASRM or attack surface or external attack surface management gives you is the proactive capability. So before something's happened, you've got the ability to kind of reduce the risk and do something about it straight away before it becomes a problem for you. And so the name of the game really is to look at what we call the residual risk. And if you can minimize that, you can then live with it. You can comfortably say, I've got my bases covered, I'm good to go. We know what the residual risk is, and I can tolerate that. And this is typically what organizations want to do. Certainly from a board level point of view, all organizations will take risk to run a business. And it's about understanding what the residual is and how you kind of minimize it. Okay. So, where do we begin? Certainly from an underlying capability point of view, the very first thing you want to consider is something like an asset graph. And what the asset graph is really giving you is a number of things. It's giving you a picture of visibility of what you have in real time. It also gives you an indication of the weakness of some of the configurations that you have in that environment. So I'm giving you a risk view on what's happening. The third thing it will give you is really a connectivity relationship between these assets that you can visualize. This is a core capability that you need, right? When you do it on premise, it's fairly easy to understand, but in the cloud where you're using different services, different pieces of infrastructure, it's hard to visualize. And this is an example of what we're looking to achieve here. We've got an asset graph here that we can see an EC2 instance. We can see the users that are connected through to it, through the IAM profiles. We can see the volumes that are mapped to it. And we can see the VPCs that are connected to it as well. This is key because what this allows you to do is it allows you to form a foundation for going on the front foot for doing something called predictive analysis, right? Which is the second stage of this. So predictive analysis is all around looking at those relationships and giving you an idea of what a potential attack path could look like. If a threat actor was to compromise an asset, we want to know what does the lateral movement look like, kind of east-west from that entry point, and to be able to visualize that. And this builds up on the last kind of slide that I presented. Here we can see the path coming through, all the way from the internet out to a VPC gateway, onto the subnet, onto the EC2 instance, and then ultimately back to the RDS instance, where the core data is. What you can start doing now is to start putting some playbooks in place, say, if I see these capabilities, this is my response playbook that I want to run. And you can automate that response playbook. This is the key to it, right? It's about automation, it's about going at speed. The next kind of capability we want to look at is really around file security. Files kind of move around your infrastructure generally. We're seeing more and more use of people uploading data. If you think about things like, empowering users for things like insurance or banking, people are loading data up. But these are all untrusted sources, and you need to be able to protect them. So you need to think about a capability whereby users can ultimately upload data. You have the ability to kind of scan that data in real time without having to put additional infrastructure in play. So what I'm talking about is looking at an an S3 bucket and be able to see data coming in, be able to scan it, put it into a clean bucket or a quarantine bucket, being able to embed that capability into an API, for example, and then pass it to downstream applications or users. And we're seeing more and more machine-to-machine comms happening, and certainly over the internet, and this is where it becomes key. By the time you stand up an EC2 to mount a volume, check it, it just adds delay, right? It stops that innovation that we're trying to fuel. And here, we're kind of doing the next level of that, something called data posture security management. So DSPM is all about looking at the data, who's touching it, and how it's moving around. Here's an example of what we could see. At the top, we can see a risk score that's going along with it. We can see the silos. We can see what's being mapped, what's protected, what isn't, and what are people doing to it. And this all adds to that kind of early view that I talked about. The next kind of area is all around cloud infrastructure entitlement management. I suppose in old speak, this is what we would call AAA, access, authorization, auditing, but it's got on steroids. What can people do based on their identity? What services can they access? We've seen a first round of that with CSPM, but this is where it's actually going. What can people actually do? And this actually maps into the overall risk scoring that we've set before. Really important when it comes to machine, I would say. Knowing what is going on, what is that entity allowed to do, whether it's a human or a machine or a piece of software or an API. And then looking at kind of, actually, you can see on the top right-hand side, some of the changes that may have gone on with that data. So I know I've talked about a lot very quickly. And in this kind of world of cloud native, I've talked about some capabilities, talked about some strategies, and you may have them. But the key is, how do you deploy them? Do you do them independently? Do you do them as a platform? Do you do something differently? And really what I'm trying to say here is, that's just one layer to consider. But the top line strategy has to be around protection, detection, response, and that kind of risk management side. Because when you start doing that, you can start actually enhancing your maturity in this space and being able to do more. Certainly when you look about, the broad capabilities on the outer circle, they're kind of key. The question is, how do you consume them? Put it in a platform that works. And this is where trend can kind of help. This is just one, I'm not trying to promote our products here, but this is a capability of the platform that we can provide. And a platform play really allows you to kind of build on the foundation, going to the next layer, going to the next layer. Here we can see that happening. You've got your core services at the bottom. You've got the mid tier where you're starting to do some correlation. And then the top tier where you're starting to actually have a centralized visibility view of what your infrastructure looks like, where it's going, and what you need to do. And really, this is my last slide in terms of takeaways. So we know there is a surge in cyber attacks, certainly on public cloud services. There's been many high-profile cases, I would say. The second thing is that each stage of the cloud introduces inherent risk. And we need to think about managing that risk, doing something to mitigate it or bring it down to an acceptable level that is right for your organization. Some of the common risks that we see are certainly around misconfiguration, predominantly, looking at kind of API sets that have not been configured properly or VPN gateways, things like that. Ultimately leading to data breaches, insider threats, and more importantly is those compliance violations. My advice would be think about a platform-based approach to this rather than getting lots of different pieces, because then you're left with the integration issue. You're left with, how do I run a playbook that's consistent across everything? How do I get a unified view? And so a platform-based approach would certainly help. If you'd like to hear more about the platform, we're on stand P1 in the main hall over there. I'll be over there most of the day. We've got demos to show you as well. And really that's it. Thank you very much.